A racist and corrupt police officer harassed a black woman inside a courtroom, in front of everyone, not knowing he had just picked the wrong black woman to mess with. What she did to him left the entire justice system in shock. It started on a quiet Thursday morning, the kind where people shuffle through metal detectors and sit in cold court benches trying not to fall asleep. A police brutality trial was underway, a case like so many others that came before it, where the officers sat smug behind their uniforms and the victims sat trembling, just trying to be heard. The woman, poised, confident but calm, was seated silently on the left side of the courtroom, waiting for her turn to speak. She wasn't dressed in anything extravagant, just simple clothes, her natural curls pulled back, glasses tucked neatly above her eyes. And yet, the moment she stepped forward to take her seat near the witness stand, the officer, the one being accused in the trial, tilted back in his chair and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Who let the maid in here? This isn't a cleaning shift, sweetheart." Some people chuckled under their breath. Others stared down, pretending not to hear. But he didn't stop. He leaned in toward another officer and said, "These people just can't stay away from a courtroom. Either they're testifying or getting sentenced." Then he turned to her and added with a smirk, "Hope you brought your green card. Oh wait, you probably don't need one, y'all always slip through anyway." And she just stood there. Calm. Still. Eyes locked on his with a stare so cold it silenced even the other whispers around the room. For a second, the entire court paused. And then, with one simple nod, she took her seat and waited for the judge. No response. No outburst. No emotional breakdown. She just waited. What that officer, what none of them, knew at that moment, was that this wasn't just another bystander, another witness, another black woman who could be silenced with disrespect. This woman had been planted there. Every step of that trial, every whisper in the room, every motion filed before the hearing, it had all been part of a calculated operation. Not by accident. Not by coincidence. But by design. Because for months, maybe even years, she'd been watching. Documenting. Building a case. A real one. Not the kind that sits buried in red tape, but the kind that explodes, the kind that flips a system inside out. That courtroom wasn't her first rodeo. It was her stage. And that officer, with his lazy arrogance and rotten past, was her main act. He thought he was above the law. He thought his badge would shield him, that his white skin and smug grin would protect him like it always had. He didn't know that every word he spoke in that courtroom had been recorded. That every laugh shared with the judge, every smirk passed to the other officers, had been anticipated. He didn't realize that the woman he humiliated in front of everyone had spent the last 6 months working undercover with federal investigators to take down a corruption network that stretched far beyond just him. And the judge? He wasn't innocent either. That's why the trial was arranged so perfectly. That's why that exact woman was assigned to be there. To watch how far they would go when they thought no one important was watching. When they thought the woman in front of them was nobody. But let's rewind. Imagine standing there, being laughed at, insulted, erased in front of an entire courtroom of strangers. Imagine the rage boiling under your skin, the lump in your throat, the fire burning in your stomach telling you to stand up, scream, fight back. And yet, she didn't. She didn't need to. Because she knew. She knew what was coming. She knew what she was holding in her briefcase. She knew the files, the audio tapes, the testimonies, the internal memos with forged signatures, the sealed reports from previous misconduct cases that had been covered up. She knew that every eye roll they gave her, every dismissive word, every demeaning laugh was only sealing their fate even tighter. What the officer didn't know, was that the woman he mocked had already signed the documents that would suspend his badge indefinitely. What the judge didn't know, was that his secret bank transactions had already been traced and matched to tampered case outcomes. And what the courtroom didn't expect, was that by the end of that day, their idea of who holds power, who gets to humiliate who, would be shattered. But it didn't happen with a gun. It didn't happen with yelling or public outrage. It happened with something far more dangerous: truth, patience, and power in silence. Because when she stood again, not as a witness, but as a federal agent in charge of the operation, you could hear the collective breath being sucked out of the room. The smirks vanished. The chuckles died. And in that moment, she didn't need revenge. She already had justice. But what exactly did she do with the officer that left everyone speechless? What came next was something no one could have predicted. And the question that echoes in every hallway of that courthouse even today is, how did no one see it coming? Before we begin this story, we want to say something important. To every black viewer watching this, we see you, we respect you, and we stand with you. At Plow of Twist, we do not and will never tolerate racism, discrimination, or any form of injustice. Our stories are meant to reflect truth, spark thought, and above all, stand on the side of justice and empowerment. Now, get ready for a powerful ride. Enjoy the story. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like this video if it moves you. Let's go. It was the end of winter in Richmond, Virginia. The city carried a heavy grayness, like a permanent shadow over its streets, as if history itself still weighed on the bricks of its courthouse and the cracked sidewalks around it. The morning was slow, thick with that quiet tension that hovers in government buildings, where the cold lighting hums above linoleum floors, and the scent of old coffee mingles with bureaucracy and indifference. And inside the Richmond District Courthouse, the usual procession was underway, public defenders checking their watches, bailiffs leaning on doorframes, and judges flipping through files without looking anyone in the eye. That was the world people like Marcus Dale thrived in, a world where the system always bent to favor the ones who wore a badge or a robe, no matter how dirty their hands were underneath. Marcus Dale had been with the Richmond Police Department for almost 17 years. Tall, broad-chested, with a jaw clenched like a trap, he was the kind of cop who knew how to keep his name out of trouble even while swimming neck-deep in it. He walked like he owned the place, not just the courtroom, but the city itself, and in many ways, he did. He'd built a reputation for getting things done, which usually meant intimidating witnesses, cutting corners, and turning street stops into headline arrests, most of which never made it past trial. People talked, of course. Internally, his file had more complaints than commendations. But that never mattered. Every IA report got inconclusive. Every dashcam malfunctioned. And every person who stood up to him somehow got discredited, relocated, or silenced. He had powerful friends, the kind who wore suits and lived in the judge's chambers. People like Judge Raymond Hollowell, a man with a pristine reputation on paper, but whose private alliances told a different story. Hollowell had served on the bench for over 2 decades, admired for his impartiality, though those who paid attention knew he had a soft spot for officers like Marcus. Their relationship was never written anywhere, but it didn't have to be. It was in the smirks passed across the room, the unchallenged objections, the favorable rulings. It was in the way Hollowell always gave Marcus's word the final say, even when witnesses shook in fear trying to describe what he'd done. And that's what made March 6th so routine, at least at first. It was just another excessive force case. Another black man beaten during a stop, another video clip with no audio, another day in court where truth got swallowed by doubt. Judge Hollowell was assigned. Marcus was the star witness. And no one expected anything to come from it. But then she walked in. Her name was Amara Bell. 34 years old, born and raised in Baltimore but recently relocated to Richmond for work. She had a calmness about her that made people underestimate her, a quiet presence that blended into places most people overlooked. But she didn't come from quiet. Her past was carved from struggle, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, educated in public schools where funding was always promised but never delivered. Amara had fought for everything she had. She was the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke, who read every line of a contract before signing, and who never let her emotions speak before her principles. Amara had spent years climbing through the ranks of legal institutions, starting with internships no one wanted, long nights behind law books, and countless closed doors. Being black and a woman in the legal world meant earning every inch of respect, and even then, some rooms refused to acknowledge her presence. But she learned to navigate it. She learned to observe, to adapt, and most of all, to prepare. She never walked into a room without knowing exactly who was in it, what they'd done, and how they'd try to hide it. And on that day, she walked into the Richmond courthouse not as a lawyer, not as an agent, but simply as a witness. That's how it was supposed to look. That's how she planned it. She was called to testify about an incident that happened near a bus station where Marcus Dale had made an arrest that turned violent. She had seen it from across the street, and her name had been submitted as a last-minute witness. The prosecution didn't know much about her. They didn't have to. The defense assumed she was just another civilian trying to help. And Marcus? He didn't even glance at her twice, not until she stood up to take her seat near the front. That's when he saw her, saw the way she carried herself, the silence in her steps, the sharpness in her eyes. And that's when he decided to humiliate her. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, confidence dripping off of him like oil. "Who let the maid in?" he muttered to the officer beside him, loud enough for the front bench to hear. A couple chuckles followed. "She better not try to clean the witness stand while she's up there." Another laugh. Then he looked her in the eye. "Hope you brought your green card, or at least know where the kitchen is in this building." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She simply walked to her seat and waited. But the room had heard it. And not one person said a word. That moment, that exact moment, was the beginning. The catalyst. And none of them knew what they had just triggered. Amara had studied Marcus for months. She knew every complaint filed against him, every name redacted in reports, every case that Judge Hollowell had presided over involving Marcus. She knew their rhythms, their tactics, their shortcuts. She had watched them through a lens far more precise than the courthouse cameras. But none of that mattered in that room. What mattered was how they treated her when they thought she had no power. How quickly their true selves surfaced when they assumed she was beneath them. And how comfortable they were humiliating a woman in public just for existing in the wrong skin. That courtroom wasn't about justice. Not for them. It was a theater. A place where roles were pre-written, and verdicts handed out before trials even began. But Amara wasn't there to play a part. She was there to rewrite the script. Outside those walls, she lived in a modest apartment near the James River, quiet and away from the noise of the city. Her life was carefully compartmentalized. No social media. No distractions. Just folders, notes, recordings, and timelines. She had spent the last 8 years working on civil rights cases across the East Coast, digging into police misconduct and judicial corruption, always behind the curtain, always off the record. Richmond was her newest post. A city with a long, tangled history of injustice and a perfect candidate for exposure. She had been sent not to observe, but to act. And now, the action had begun. In the weeks before the trial, she had worked quietly with a select team gathering testimonies, piecing together patterns, and accessing internal databases. The operation was delicate. Any wrong move could get it shut down. Any exposure could put her name in danger. But now, in that room, her mission had reached its boiling point. Marcus Dale had handed her the final piece, public, undeniable, recorded humiliation, fueled by racism and confidence in his own immunity. And Judge Hollowell? His silence said it all. He didn't stop it. He didn't even look surprised. Just flipped through his papers, pretending not to hear. The people in the room didn't know what they'd witnessed. Just another day. Another rude cop. Another black woman ignored. But for Amara, it was the turning point. She could feel it. The air had shifted. And from that point forward, the question wasn't whether justice would come. It was when. Because underneath that calm, that silence, that measured gaze, Amara Bell was holding a storm. One built not on revenge, but on purpose. One that would take down everything Marcus Dale thought untouchable. One that would finally force Richmond to confront the rot beneath its polished floors and legal smiles. What no one in that courtroom knew, was that by the end of that week, the very system that had protected Marcus and Judge Hollowell for decades would be standing on trial. And the woman they laughed at? She wouldn't be sitting in the witness chair. She would be holding the gavel. The day after the courtroom incident, Amara walked through the corridors of the federal building with her coat still buttoned to the collar, eyes sharp, hands full with files and printouts clipped neatly in color-coded tabs. Her badge remained tucked inside her leather satchel, unseen, unnamed, invisible, just like she needed to be. She wasn't ready to reveal herself. Not yet. The plan had always required time, patience, and above all, precision. One misstep, and months of quiet infiltration would unravel. The comments Marcus had made in that courtroom weren't just offensive, they were fuel. Proof of his arrogance. Proof that he was everything her case had alleged, and then some. But Amara had learned long ago that in systems like this, facts weren't enough. You needed impact. You needed leverage. You needed a moment so undeniable that it cracked open the illusion of order and forced people to see what had always been there. That moment was coming. But it wasn't time yet. Inside the operations room, a team of 5 agents waited around a long table covered in folders and photos, a web of timelines strung together with red thread across one of the whiteboards. They all stood as she entered, not out of formality, but out of respect. She had led the investigation from day one, and they knew the weight she carried wasn't just professional. It was personal. Not because of Marcus Dale, but because of everything he represented. Any movement from Hollowell's office? She asked without sitting down. One of the agents, a woman named Rosa, handed her a printed summary. Hollowell had approved a sequence of internal rulings dismissing unrelated misconduct complaints from the same precinct Marcus worked in. That was his pattern, trimming the edges, erasing smoke before anyone saw the fire. Another agent, Sean, updated her on financial data. Marcus had made 3 large cash deposits in the past 2 months, none of them reported, none of them traceable to official income. Amara skimmed the documents, then looked up. What about surveillance? That's when Rosa hesitated. We've got a complication. Dale's been meeting off-grid. No phones. No electronics. And whoever he's talking to is careful. Amara folded her arms. That means they're scared. That's good. Keep pressure on the outer rings. Let them know something's moving. But no noise. Not until I give the word. The team nodded. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. Every person in that room had seen enough corruption disguised as procedure to understand what they were up against. But Amara wasn't looking to make a point. She was building a case airtight enough to hold up in both federal court and the public eye. And she wasn't just after Marcus. She wanted the whole system, or at least the part of it that had allowed men like him to operate unchecked. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Marcus Dale sat in the break room with 2 other officers, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. The case had recessed for a few days to allow the court to review new evidence, and he seemed unconcerned. Laughing about his weekend plans, trash-talking lawyers, and making jokes about protesters and social justice types. One of the officers, younger, less seasoned, asked if he thought the witness from yesterday, the one you called the maid, was going to cause trouble. Marcus snorted, leaned back in his chair, and said, "She can cause all the trouble she wants. I've got friends in high places. That chick could have walked in here wearing the Constitution, and Hollowell still wouldn't let her say a word that mattered." They all laughed. But behind the mirror of a hidden surveillance cam planted weeks earlier, Amara watched the footage in silence. Every word was time-stamped, documented, filed. Not because it was illegal, but because it proved motive. Pattern. Mindset. And above all, impunity. That was the part that needed to be broken. Later that night, Amara met quietly with a man named Kenneth, a former officer who had resigned after clashing with Marcus during an internal investigation years ago. He had kept his distance ever since, wary of retaliation, but Amara had convinced him to come forward. In a dim parking lot near the river, inside his pickup truck, he handed her a flash drive. "There's stuff on there no one ever wanted to put in writing," he said, his voice low. "Logs, photos, names. Some of it's from internal training sessions. Stuff they covered up. I don't want credit. Just, use it right." Amara took it, looked him in the eye. "I will." That same week, she quietly met with one of the assistant DAs, a young black attorney named Brielle who had grown increasingly frustrated with how certain cases disappeared. Brielle had noticed her own files being altered, motions vanishing from the system, witnesses reassigned before testifying. She hadn't known where to turn until Amara reached out. Now, they worked together in secrecy, pooling information, comparing notes, building a map of the courthouse from the inside. Still, Amara kept her true role hidden from everyone in the courtroom. When she walked back in for the trial's continuation, she wore the same quiet expression, the same modest attire. Marcus barely looked at her. The judge barely acknowledged her. But the jury was starting to see. They had noticed something had shifted, the tone, the tension. The prosecution was suddenly sharper. The questions, more specific. Objections rose faster. The defense was sweating. Hollowell started delaying recesses. The energy in the room was no longer routine. It was taut. Like something was being held back. Like something massive was coming. During a lunch break, Amara stepped outside for air. Brielle caught up with her near the fountain, eyes scanning the sidewalk for ears. "I don't know what you're doing," Brielle said, "but keep doing it. People are whispering. Even Hollowell's clerk looks nervous." Amara glanced at the courthouse behind them. "They should be. You've got more than just a witness file, don't you?" Amara didn't answer. Just smiled faintly. "Let's just say. I didn't walk into that courtroom without knowing what I'd find." Inside, Marcus felt the shift too. He noticed how certain jurors wouldn't meet his eyes anymore. How the judge seemed to be stalling more than ruling. Something was wrong, but he couldn't name it. And that made him angrier. He stormed into the judge's chambers later that day, closed the door, and hissed, "This case is slipping. That girl, she's not just a witness. I don't know what she is, but she's not normal." Judge Hollowell looked up from his desk, calm. "She's a nobody. Just let the system work. It always does." But Marcus didn't believe it anymore. Not fully. Back at her apartment that night, Amara sat at her kitchen table surrounded by printed transcripts and audio recordings. One hand stirred a cup of tea while the other clicked through files. The case had reached a critical threshold. Enough evidence had been gathered. Enough support had been built. The final piece, the exposure, had to be timed with surgical precision. Because once the curtain dropped, there'd be no going back. And in her mind, she already saw it, the silence of the room, the shift in their faces, the moment when every smug expression drained away and truth came crashing through like a wrecking ball. But no one else knew that moment was near. Not yet. And when it comes, not a single soul in that courtroom will be ready for what she's about to reveal. The courtroom was full that morning. Every bench occupied, every hallway buzzing with the soft murmurs of tension and the rustling of papers. A few reporters hovered near the back wall, pretending not to record, pens moving quickly, eyes scanning every face. The air felt heavy, like something unspoken had filled the space. There were no alarms, no warnings, just that strange, static silence before a storm breaks loose. Amara entered without looking at anyone. She moved straight to her seat on the witness side, her expression unreadable, her body still. Her hands folded neatly over her lap, and she sat upright, as if the room hadn't been designed to make her feel small. The judge didn't make eye contact. Marcus Dale, already seated near the front, leaned back with one arm over the bench behind him, chewing on a pen cap, scanning her face for any sign of weakness. His stare was smug, but his foot tapped against the floor. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, before we proceed with closing statements, the witness would like to submit new evidence regarding this case. We've reviewed it, and we believe it is not only relevant but crucial to the integrity of these proceedings." Judge Hollowell glanced over his glasses, annoyed. "New evidence at this stage?" "Yes, Your Honor. It includes documentation, audio files, and internal communications directly related to the witness's original testimony, as well as behavior observed during these proceedings." There was a pause. The judge's fingers tapped against the wooden podium slowly. "Fine. Submit it. Let's move quickly." Amara stood. She reached into the black leather satchel by her feet and pulled out a thick envelope and a flash drive, both labeled, both pristine. She walked forward. The bailiff took them from her and delivered them to the clerk, who plugged in the drive and projected the contents onto the screen behind the judge. The room dimmed. A cold blue light filled the air. Then a voice came through the speakers. Marcus Dale's voice. It was him, laughing. "These people just can't stay out of courtrooms. It's either drugs or drama with them." Another voice, one of his fellow officers, responding with a joke about food stamps. Then more audio, grainy but clear, a conversation recorded during a break in a different trial months ago, Marcus boasting about how easy it was to get rid of complaints, naming Judge Hollowell directly. "You just gotta send the report his way," he said in the recording, chuckling. "He'll bury it so deep you'll forget it ever existed." The courtroom froze. Hollowell's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Dale turned sharply toward the screen, his lips slightly parted, the blood draining from his face. The prosecutor turned toward the judge. "There's more, Your Honor. But I believe the court should hear directly from the witness." Under oath. Judge Hollowell didn't speak. He nodded stiffly. Amara returned to the stand. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every person in the room was already leaning forward. "I came to this courtroom as a witness," she began, "but I was also here on assignment. For the past 10 months, I've been part of a federal investigation into patterns of racial misconduct, falsified evidence, and judicial corruption involving officers from the Richmond Police Department and members of this court. The operation was classified, authorized by the Department of Justice, and backed by multiple internal departments. I have spent the last several months collecting statements from victims, compiling data, and documenting systemic violations that go far beyond this one case." A gasp rose from somewhere near the back. The reporters stopped pretending and now openly filmed, pens down, mouths slightly open. She continued. "What we found was a deeply rooted chain of complicity, from the way reports were filed, to how certain cases were dismissed, to how officers like Marcus Dale operated under the protection of a judicial figure who turned a blind eye, not once or twice, but repeatedly." Marcus stood suddenly. "That's a lie. She's lying. This is insane." Amara turned her head slowly to face him, her voice calm but steel-edged. "You don't remember me, Officer Dale. But you should. 4 years ago, in Baltimore, you testified in a case where a teenager was wrongly accused of assaulting you during a traffic stop. That teenager was my cousin." Marcus blinked, confusion on his face. "He spent 14 months in juvenile detention before the charges were dropped. You were never held accountable. But I remember your face. And I remember your words." She looked out at the jury, her voice steady. "This is not personal vengeance. This is not an ambush. This is accountability. And the truth doesn't come when it's convenient. It comes when it's necessary." Judge Hollowell's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth again, then closed it. The prosecutor turned to him. "Your Honor, we are also submitting a request for your immediate recusal from this case, as well as a formal investigation into your conduct in relation to Officer Dale and several previous rulings. The evidence presented shows not only misconduct but potential criminal negligence." Hollowell stared down, speechless. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now buzzed with disbelief. Marcus looked around, realizing for the first time that no one was coming to his defense. The other officers sat still, avoiding eye contact. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he didn't move. Then Amara looked directly at Marcus. "You humiliated me. Not just with your words, but with your certainty. You were sure I had no power. You were sure I didn't belong. But you were wrong. And now you'll have to live with the truth that the system you thought protected you was watching the whole time. And this time, it chose to listen." Marcus's mouth opened, searching for something to say, but the words didn't come. And then came the final blow. The screen behind the judge shifted to show a signature. A bank transfer. A private message between Hollowell and Dale confirming the suppression of evidence from 3 separate trials. The courtroom was silent. Amara stepped down from the witness stand. The prosecutor turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the people move for the immediate detainment of Officer Marcus Dale pending formal charges. We also request that the court allow federal oversight moving forward while the investigation expands." There was no protest. No defense. Just silence. And as the bailiffs moved toward Marcus, he stepped back instinctively, his voice finally rising, but shaking. "This is a setup. She tricked everyone. She's lying." But it didn't matter. Because no one believed him anymore. And for the first time in years, he was the one being silenced. What happened next would change not only Marcus's life, but the entire Richmond justice system. And still, there was one thing no one in the room yet knew. The investigation wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because Amara had one last name on her list. And it hadn't been revealed, yet. The door to the courtroom slammed open as 2 federal agents entered in silence, their presence immediate, their energy unmistakably different from anyone who'd walked those halls before. They moved with quiet precision toward Marcus Dale, whose eyes darted from one uniform to the other, his chest rising faster now, his bravado cracking inch by inch under the weight of reality. The bailiff stepped back instinctively, making room for the agents who carried with them not just authority but finality. Marcus's voice was hoarse, his protestation barely more than a whisper now. "You can't do this. You can't let her do this to me." His eyes flicked toward Judge Hollowell, pleading, desperate. Tell them. Tell them who I am." But Hollowell didn't speak. He hadn't said a word since the screen displayed the damning message with his digital signature. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass of water, his lips barely wetting with the sip. He looked smaller somehow, aged. Powerless. And for the first time in his long career, the room was no longer his to command. Amara watched it all unfold without moving. She didn't smile. There was no satisfaction written across her face, only resolve. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about dismantling a wall that had taken decades to build, brick by brick, case by case, silence by silence. She stood beside the prosecutor now, her hands calmly at her sides, letting the room absorb the consequences of its own neglect. Marcus looked toward her again, as if suddenly realizing the depth of the miscalculation. "You think this makes you better than me?" he spat out, his voice loud now, desperate. "You think this proves something?" Amara finally looked at him, her tone measured, unwavering. "No. This doesn't make me better. It makes me right. And it shows what happens when people stop being afraid of men like you." He laughed then, but it was empty, sharp, breaking in the middle like glass under pressure. "This is just politics. You'll see. They'll forget this. People forget everything." Amara stepped closer, just enough to look him directly in the eye. Not this time. The agent secured his wrists, metal cuffs clicking with a finality that echoed louder than any gavel ever had in that courtroom. His eyes widened as he realized they weren't heading toward the side-holding cell, they were escorting him out through the main doors, past every journalist, every citizen, every camera lens now fixed on him. For once, there would be no shielding, no backroom exit, no quiet resolution. This was public. This was permanent. Judge Hollowell remained seated, his eyes low, hands gripping the edge of his bench as if holding on to the last remnants of control. The silence was broken when the prosecutor turned toward him. Your Honor, in light of the new evidence, we also move to suspend your judicial authority pending an internal ethics review and federal audit. The courtroom shifted again, whispers rising, someone audibly gasping. Hollowell's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but no sound came. He looked at Amara, and for a flicker of a second, something in his expression shifted, not anger, not denial, but fear. Quiet, shame-soaked fear. He tried to collect himself. This courtroom. This entire court. I've served it for 25 years. Amara responded quietly. And in that time, how many voices did you silence? How many truths did you bury for the sake of familiarity? For the comfort of men like him? The judge blinked slowly. You don't understand what it's like. The pressure. The politics. You get told which cases to dismiss, who's protected, where the lines are drawn. Amara leaned in, her voice low but firm. Then you should have never worn the robe. He looked down, and for the first time since the hearing began, the room saw him not as a judge, but as a man, flawed, crumbling, exposed. The clerk stepped forward with trembling hands and quietly handed the bailiff a folded document bearing the DOJ's seal, an official order placing the court under temporary federal oversight. It was the first time in Richmond's history that such action had been taken. A systemic audit would begin the following day. Every case involving Marcus Dale and Judge Hollowell would be reviewed. Every victim whose voice had been ignored would now have their files reopened. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. What started as a quiet curiosity had grown into a public reckoning. People held signs. Some chanted names. Others just stood in silence, watching as the doors opened and Marcus was led out into the daylight, his face pale, eyes squinting, chained and flanked by federal agents. The cameras didn't need zoom lenses, they were already there, ready. This moment had waited far too long to be kept behind closed doors. Inside, the tension remained thick. Amara walked out slowly, her heels quiet on the tiled floor, her back straight, her breath steady. Every step echoed not just with purpose, but with the weight of generations before her, people who had tried to speak and been silenced, people who had raised their hands in courtrooms and been dismissed, people whose stories were never given time, space, or value. Today was not about her. It was about them. As she reached the corridor, Brielle met her at the end of the hallway, her eyes wet but fierce. You really did it, she said, voice hushed, almost reverent. You broke the machine. Amara shook her head gently. I just showed them what it was made of. Are you okay? Brielle asked. Amara looked out the window, watching the crowd gather. I will be. They walked together into the sunlight. Behind them, inside the courthouse, the ripple had begun. Phones rang with urgency. Papers were shuffled, files reopened. A storm had landed in the heart of a system that had counted on silence. And now, it would have to answer. That night, Amara stood alone in her apartment, the city quiet outside her window. She poured herself a glass of water and stood still for a long time, letting her thoughts drift. Not toward what had happened, but toward what still lay ahead. Because while Marcus and Hollowell had been exposed, there were others. Other judges. Other officers. Other systems still hiding behind red tape and polished floors. Her phone vibrated on the counter. It was Rosa. We got the last signature, Rosa said. The one on the transfer from the prison contracts. You were right. It wasn't Hollowell. It was someone higher. Amara's eyes narrowed slightly. Send it to me. She hung up and sat down, opening her laptop. The screen lit up with a new name. A familiar one. Suddenly, it was clear, the final piece. The person behind the curtain. And she knew. The real storm hadn't even started yet. The fallout didn't arrive like a thunderclap, it moved through the city like a slow quake, disrupting everything from the ground up. Within 48 hours, the Richmond Police Department was under federal supervision, the courthouse's docket was frozen, and 2 emergency press conferences had been scheduled by city officials trying to control a narrative that was already slipping out of their hands. On national news outlets, Amara Bell's name had started to surface, cautiously at first, just whispers in articles, speculation from legal analysts, but those whispers grew into headlines when her full testimony was released to the public. She became the face of a reckoning much larger than Marcus Dale or Judge Hollowell, though she'd never asked for that spotlight. She hadn't done it to be remembered. She'd done it because people needed to be reminded that silence was never neutrality, and neutrality was never justice. Behind the scenes, though, the weight of her actions grew heavier with each passing hour. In the small, windowless conference room of the federal building, Amara sat across from a DOJ liaison who had flown in from D.C. after the courtroom eruption. He was younger than expected, sharp, polished, but with a restlessness behind his words, like he was trying to catch up to a story already outpacing him. He placed a manila folder on the table and opened it slowly, revealing a series of names, bank records, and dates that connected more than just Dale and Hollowell to the misconduct. There were more signatures, more messages, and the name that had landed on Amara's screen the night before was now printed in bold at the top of the final page. Victor Langston. The current state attorney general. He had built his reputation as a reformist, a progressive mind, the kind of leader who took podiums and said all the right things. But underneath the speeches and staged initiatives, there was a trail of selective prosecutions and sealed settlements that now made perfect sense. Langston had been protecting more than just officers, he had been safeguarding an entire political machine. He wasn't just another corrupt official. He was the firewall. The one who made sure nothing ever reached public light unless it served a political purpose. And now Amara was staring down a much larger storm, one that couldn't be handled in a single courtroom or with a single confession. The DOJ liaison spoke softly. If we go after him, it won't just be about Richmond anymore. This will hit the state, maybe beyond. You'll need to testify again. Possibly in a federal grand jury. And there will be consequences. Amara nodded slowly, absorbing the magnitude of the next step. He's the one who approved the budgets that covered up the settlements. He knew exactly what he was doing. The liaison hesitated. You understand what happens if he falls. That brings down a lot more than just him. She didn't flinch. Then they need to fall too. But as the investigation expanded, Amara began to feel the sharp edges of public attention. Not all the responses were praise. For every article that called her a hero, there was a commentator accusing her of overreach. For every protester who lifted her name on a sign, there was an anonymous threat sent to her inbox. The courthouse might have shifted, but the undercurrent of power hadn't disappeared, it had just grown quieter, more calculated. She started noticing cars parked outside her apartment that didn't belong. Phone calls with no answer. A delay in messages she had sent that once arrived instantly. And then came the internal pushback. Rosa came into her office late one night, holding a document with trembling hands. They're trying to remove you from the case, she whispered, voice breaking. They're claiming conflict of interest because of your family connection in the Baltimore case. Amara's chest tightened. That was years ago. And I disclosed that when I applied to the task force. They're not using logic, Rosa replied, dropping into the chair across from her. They're using fear. Langston's people are trying to corner you. If they get you off this case, it all slows down. Delays buy them time. Time to spin this. To bury it again. Amara looked out the window of her office. The skyline shimmered with lights that no longer felt familiar. Everything was exposed now. Everything she had worked for sat on the edge of a knife. And beneath all of it was a growing question pressing against her chest, a question she hadn't allowed herself to fully consider until now. How far was she willing to go? Later that week, she received a private meeting request from Langston himself. At first, she ignored it. Then the request came again, this time through official channels. A lunch meeting. Public. Neutral ground. She debated it for hours before finally deciding she needed to hear him speak for himself. The restaurant was upscale but quiet, tucked in a corner of downtown where people went to disappear, not to be seen. Langston sat at the far end of a corner booth, smiling like an old friend. His demeanor was warm, polished, inviting, exactly the version of himself the public adored. But his eyes told another story. They watched her too closely. Calculated every move. "I admire what you've done," he began, as she sat across from him. "Truly. It takes courage to challenge systems that have been in place longer than any of us have been alive." Amara said nothing. She waited. Langston folded his hands. But courage doesn't always equal strategy. And right now, the path you're on, it's reckless. You think you're breaking chains, but you're pulling at a thread that could unravel everything. Funding, community support, even reforms already in motion. She leaned forward, her voice steady. "So I should stop because it's inconvenient for your brand?" Langston's smile thinned. "I'm saying you should think about the bigger picture. You bring me down, you don't just take out a man. You take out an office. A movement. And the public? They don't always care about nuance. They'll see chaos. And they'll blame you for it." Amara held his gaze. "Then maybe it's time they saw the truth, even if it's messy." Langston exhaled. "I'm offering you a path forward. You resign quietly. The DOJ closes the file with some language about insufficient evidence. In exchange, we open a new initiative, your name attached. You'll lead it. Statewide reform. Real change. You'll have a seat at the table." She stared at him for a long moment. Then said one word. "No." The silence stretched between them. He leaned back, cold now. "You're making a mistake." She stood. "I didn't come this far to start asking for permission." As she walked out of the restaurant, she felt her heart pounding, not from fear, but from clarity. There was no compromise. There was no middle ground between truth and survival. What she was doing would cost her comfort, maybe even safety, but it would not cost her integrity. By the time she reached her office, an emergency meeting had been called. The DOJ liaison stood by the window, holding his phone. "Langston's team just launched a campaign accusing you of falsifying documents. They're calling for an independent review of your credentials." Rosa looked like she'd been punched in the chest. "They're really coming after you." Amara nodded once. "Let them." Because she knew now, this wasn't just about exposing a system. It was about proving that justice could not be bargained with. But still, one decision remained. The grand jury date was set. And Amara had been given an offer to settle. Not from Langston. From Washington. If she chose to move forward, everything would come crashing down. Not just in Richmond. But across the entire state. Possibly beyond. And she had to choose. Would she protect the fragile steps already taken? Or would she push further, into the unknown, risking everything for the full truth? That question hung heavy as she looked out her window at the city below. The crowd outside had grown again. This time not in protest. But in hope. And now, it was up to her. Oh ChatGPT-Ds, the night before her decision was due, Amara sat alone in the archive room beneath the federal building, a place few people ever entered without a clearance badge or a reason heavy enough to warrant it. Rows of cabinets and sealed boxes lined the walls, each one filled with fragments of stories, names, dates, and outcomes that were never supposed to meet the light. Some cases had been buried so deep they didn't even appear in digital systems anymore. She held a file in her lap, one she hadn't read in years. It belonged to her cousin. The boy who had been taken from his school bus and thrown into a detention center because an officer said he looked jumpy. The file was slim. 4 pages. The entire summary of what had changed a life. His charges had been dropped. No apology, no record cleared. Just a life cracked open and then forgotten. She had tried not to carry that memory with her, had convinced herself that her work now was bigger, more urgent, detached from personal history. But sitting there, under flickering fluorescent lights and stale air, she realized that nothing she was doing now was truly separate. Everything had a thread. And that thread had always started with someone who thought they could get away with it. The door creaked open behind her and Rosa stepped in slowly, holding a coffee in one hand and a folded note in the other. She set both down quietly beside Amara, not interrupting. After a long silence, Amara finally spoke, her voice quiet and stripped of the armor she wore in courtrooms. They think this ends with me. That if they smear my name, the noise will cover the truth. Rosa sat beside her, sighing. They don't realize the truth's already out. Even if they bury you, it's out now. Amara looked at her, eyes tired. I'm not afraid of losing this job. I'm afraid of losing the momentum. People finally started listening. They finally looked up. If I walk away now, what if it all folds back into silence? Rosa leaned in. What if it doesn't? What if you walking into that grand jury room, knowing they'll fire you, threaten you, tear you apart, that's what keeps it going? What if your sacrifice is the proof that this matters? Amara stared down at the file in her hands, slowly closing it and placing it back into its box. I don't want to be the story, Rosa. I just want the system to change. You already are the story, Rosa said softly. Now you get to choose how it ends. The following morning, she walked through the marble halls of the federal building, every step deliberate, every echo behind her a reminder that nothing about this was going back to the way it was. The press had doubled outside. She could hear their voices even before she reached the steps. Reporters calling her name, holding out microphones, asking if she had a comment about the state attorney general's accusations. Cameramen jockeying for the perfect frame. Protesters chanting on one side, counter-protesters holding signs on the other. It felt like the whole state had converged on this moment. But Amara kept walking. Past the noise. Past the tension. Into the elevator that would take her to the top floor. To the conference room where the grand jury waited behind closed doors. When she stepped in, the room turned quiet. 12 jurors, a court officer, 2 prosecutors from the Justice Department, and the truth she had carried on her back like armor now ready to be handed over. One of the prosecutors spoke first. Ms. Bell, before you begin, we need to advise you again. Once you testify, the protection you've had during the investigation will dissolve. You will become a public figure in a federal case against the state attorney general. This could impact your career permanently. Amara nodded. I understand. The other prosecutor handed her a folder. Do you wish to submit these documents as part of your statement? Amara took the folder, opened it briefly, then looked out over the room. No, she said. Not yet. I want to speak first. And then she told them everything. Not just the names or the transfers or the procedural cover-ups. She spoke about how systemic failure isn't always written in laws, but in the spaces between them. She explained how power protects itself not through force, but through quiet agreements and polite omissions. She shared how the justice system bends not when people break the law, but when those who are supposed to uphold it decide which laws matter based on who's standing in front of them. She told them what it felt like to be humiliated in a courtroom by a man who thought she didn't belong there. What it meant to hear laughter after being dehumanized. What it meant to hold her silence, not out of fear, but because she had something much louder coming. When she finished, there was no applause. No validation. Just stillness. The lead prosecutor stood. "Thank you. We'll contact you with the outcome of the panel's review." Amara stood as well, collected her papers, and left without another word. Outside the courthouse, the air had changed. The noise hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt distant. It was close now. Real. And behind it, a growing tide of people who understood the weight of what had happened. Back in her apartment that evening, Amara sat by the window, watching the news. Langston had issued another statement, calling her testimony an act of political sabotage orchestrated by radicals. But beneath his words was a tremor. His tone was defensive. The press was pressing harder. Leaked documents were appearing in articles. Victims from sealed settlements had started to come forward. And soon, the grand jury's decision would be public. As she turned off the TV, her phone rang. It was Brielle. "They're reopening 5 cases from Hollowell's docket," Brielle said breathlessly. "And Marcus, he's trying to cut a deal." Amara didn't speak at first. She closed her eyes. Breathed in deeply. "Everything's shifting," Brielle added. "Yes," Amara said. "But now we have to make sure it lands in the right place. Because justice wasn't a single moment. It was a long, painful, relentless road. And she was ready to walk every inch of it." 3 days after Amara testified before the federal grand jury, the city of Richmond was no longer operating under the illusion of normalcy. Government offices were flooded with requests for records, internal investigations were launched against department heads, and the press had taken over the courthouse steps as if it were a battlefield. There was no going back, and everyone knew it. But behind the headlines, behind the images of protests and podiums, Amara was navigating a different war, one fought in private meetings, whispered threats, and relentless pressure from those who had the most to lose. Her phone had become a portal of anxiety. Dozens of calls each day, reporters, activists, legal advisors, former victims who were finally speaking up. But it was the quiet ones that struck the hardest. The calls from anonymous voices warning her to leave it alone, or else. The texts that said they knew where she lived. She read them without flinching. Fear was no longer a choice she could afford. One evening, as she was leaving the DOJ building, she spotted a familiar figure waiting near the sidewalk. It was Kenneth, the former officer who had given her the original flash drive. He looked more worn than before, eyes shadowed, hands tucked in the pockets of his hoodie like he was holding something back. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly, falling into step beside her as they walked. Amara nodded, keeping her pace steady. "I figured you might. I saw something on the news," he continued. "They're saying Langston might step down. That he's negotiating with federal attorneys behind closed doors." "That's the rumor," she answered, not looking at him. Kenneth's voice lowered. "He's gonna try to pin it all on Hollowell and Dale. Say they went rogue. That he was misled." Amara exhaled slowly. "He's trying to frame corruption as isolation. Make it sound like a breach instead of a design." Kenneth stopped walking. "You can't let that happen." She turned to face him. "You know I'm right," he said, more forcefully now. "This doesn't end with a scapegoat. Langston wasn't blindsided, he orchestrated this. And if he walks away with a slap on the wrist, nothing changes. They'll rebuild it all." Amara stared at him. "You have more." Kenneth hesitated. "I didn't want to pull it in. It puts me too close." "Then why are you here?" He swallowed hard. "Because I can't sleep. Because I remember what it felt like to wear that uniform and shut my mouth every time I saw someone like Dale do what he did. Because I told myself I wasn't part of the problem as long as I didn't join in. But silence, it's just a different kind of violence. He reached into his coat and handed her a small drive. It's from a wire I wore 2 years ago during a meeting at Langston's campaign office. I was working part-time security. He thought I was nobody. He talked too much. And I kept it. Just in case. Amara took it with both hands, her breath catching for a moment. If this is what I think it is, Kenneth looked down. It's more than enough. That night, Amara sat alone at her desk and listened to the recording. The voice was unmistakable, Langston's polished cadence, the calm authority he wore like a tailored suit. He was speaking casually, laughing even, about how narratives are more powerful than facts, about how the public doesn't need the truth, they need direction. Then came the part that sent chills through her. They're gonna keep protesting no matter what we do, he said on the recording, so let them yell while we move the real pieces behind the curtain. Feed them a conviction or two, and they'll believe the machine's been cleaned. She paused the playback. It was undeniable. This wasn't just evidence of negligence. It was intent. Calculated manipulation. Amara sat in the stillness, hands pressed together at her lips. She had never hated power. But she had always feared what people did to keep it. The next morning, she brought the drive to the DOJ liaison. He listened in silence, his face growing more rigid with each passing sentence. This will take down his entire career, he said finally. It'll fracture the party. Maybe the administration. Amara nodded slowly. And? He met her eyes. And it's what needs to happen. But what came next was a storm Amara couldn't fully prepare for. The audio leak hit the press within 24 hours. Multiple networks picked it up at once. Langston's voice played across every television in Virginia, and soon, across the country. His office issued a statement calling the tape deeply manipulated and contextually misrepresented, but no one believed it. Within hours, federal charges were being discussed. His resignation was no longer a matter of if, but when. Still, as everything burned around him, Langston did something Amara didn't expect. He called her. She let it go to voicemail. Then he called again. And again. Finally, she answered. His voice was calm, but laced with something colder, resentment, maybe, or disbelief. You think this is justice? He asked. Amara said nothing. You think you've changed anything? Still nothing. Do you really believe people like you can tear this down and survive it? She answered quietly. I don't intend to survive it. I intend to rebuild it. There was a pause. You could have had everything. Power. Influence. A seat at the table. I don't want a seat, she said. I want to flip the table. Langston hung up. And that was the last time they spoke. In the days that followed, the city began to feel different. The fear that had once kept people quiet now turned into momentum. Victims of dismissed cases filed motions to reopen. A retired judge from another county publicly supported Amara, calling for a statewide audit. Young activists who had once been pushed aside were now advising city leaders. And through it all, Amara kept moving. Interviews. Testimony. Quiet meetings with lawmakers who, for the first time, were afraid of the people instead of just afraid of losing them. But even as the system began to bend, Amara was haunted by a deeper question, one she rarely spoke out loud. Was justice enough? Could accountability truly undo years of trauma? Could an arrest, a resignation, a conviction, really repair what had been taken? One evening, she visited the family of a man who had died in custody under Dale's watch. His mother had testified during the investigation, but this was the first time Amara had come to her home. The woman opened the door and stared at her for a long moment before letting her in. They sat together in silence for nearly 10 minutes before the woman spoke. "I thought I'd feel relief," she whispered. "But I just feel tired." Amara looked at her, tears welling in her own eyes. "I'm sorry we let it happen for so long," she said. The woman nodded. "You didn't let it happen. You stopped it. That's more than anyone ever did." They sat for another hour, not as agent and witness, not as symbols of justice or loss, but as two women who understood the weight of silence, and the cost of breaking it. When Amara returned home that night, she knew the final chapter was near. Not just for the case, but for her. For months after the storm broke, the courtroom that once echoed with Marcus Dale's arrogance and Judge Hollowell's indifference now felt like a different universe. The walls were the same, the benches unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted. The silence inside no longer carried the weight of fear. It held something sharper, awareness. The entire state had watched as the grand jury delivered its recommendations. Marcus Dale, now stripped of his badge and reputation, was sentenced on multiple counts of obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and civil rights violations. He walked into the federal prison with his hands cuffed and his eyes hollow, his face blurred in every news broadcast out of what the anchor called respect for the process. But respect was something Marcus had never earned. What the public saw was not a man being taken away. It was the system beginning to hold its breath. Judge Hollowell was disbarred and permanently removed from public office. Though he avoided jail time by cooperating with investigators, he lost everything that once defined him. His name was pulled from plaques, his past decisions scrutinized under federal audit, and every case he touched re-evaluated under the new Integrity Review Board. His fall wasn't loud, it was slow, painful, and suffocating. He moved out of Richmond without a statement, disappearing quietly the same way he once erased the truth. Victor Langston resigned in disgrace days before formal charges were filed. The leaked recording shattered any defense he might have mounted. His network of allies fractured overnight. Former supporters distanced themselves. His career, once bathed in public admiration, collapsed under the truth he tried so hard to conceal. He was indicted on conspiracy, misconduct in public office, and fraudulent use of campaign funds. But the greatest punishment was the erasure of his legacy. Langston had built an empire on the illusion of justice. Now, all that remained was the truth, laid bare for everyone to see. As for Amara Bell, her path didn't lead to political office or television deals. She turned down every offer for interviews, declined the book deals, ignored the agents who promised her speaking tours and movie scripts. Her mission was never fame, it was change. And change, she believed, had to be protected from spectacle. Instead, she accepted a quiet but powerful role leading the first independent division for civil rights and institutional accountability in Virginia, a department born from the ashes of everything she helped expose. Her new office wasn't in the marble halls of government. It was in a small building on the south side of Richmond, painted in soft blue, with a row of chairs in the waiting room and a sign on the front door that read, "We hear you." She surrounded herself with a diverse team, some lawyers, some social workers, others community organizers who had once stood outside those courthouses demanding justice. The cases they took weren't high profile, but they mattered. Children wrongfully suspended. Families displaced by biased housing rulings. Victims of abuse too afraid to speak. And Amara didn't sit behind a desk giving orders, she met them face to face, shook their hands, learned their names. She had become something rare, a public servant who didn't just serve, but understood. In time, her name began to carry weight again. But this time, it wasn't a symbol of outrage. It was a symbol of resilience. Across Richmond and beyond, other cities began to model similar departments. Policy shifted. Leaders were voted out. And slowly, the silence that had once protected corruption began to fracture under the pressure of stories told out loud. And then, one morning, something unexpected arrived. A letter. No return address. No signature. Just a folded page and a sentence, you gave me my voice back. Thank you for not giving up. She read it twice before placing it in the drawer of her desk, next to a photo of her cousin. It wasn't closure, but it was peace. The kind you earn. The kind that doesn't come from a verdict, but from knowing you did the right thing when it cost the most. Now, to you, the one listening to this story, maybe you saw yourself in Amara. Maybe you saw someone you know in the voices that were once ignored. Or maybe you recognize the weight of silence in places you walk through every day. This story wasn't about revenge. It was about reckoning. About what happens when the people we're taught to trust forget who they serve. About what it takes to reclaim that trust, not with noise, but with truth. So I want to ask you something real. Have you ever felt invisible in a room where you knew you belonged? Have you ever been told to stay quiet, not because you were wrong, but because your truth made others uncomfortable? What would you do if you had the power to change that? Because maybe you do. And maybe, you've just been waiting for the right moment to speak. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something real, then leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your voice. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, to be felt, to be remembered, then subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, share this story, and let's keep this conversation alive. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do, is listen. And then speak.